Hey everybody, Mr. Foley here. Today we are looking at aggregate demand, part of macro 5. So you're getting a little shaggy, Mr. Foley here. I need to shave, but that's all right. And you get to come from my kids' classroom. So they're learning online this year. And so this is their classroom. And also, as you can see, our treadmill room for exercise as well. A little of everything. So today we're looking at aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is going to be different from normal demand because we are looking at all the goods and services produced in an economy. This isn't just demand for Nike or demand for tires. It's demand for everything. And so we're going to look at everything together and what are some things that change how much is demanded and how does that impact our economy. So that is what the focus will be. So you'll have some notes that go along with this as well. So here we go. Introducing aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve shows the total amount of goods and services that consumers, business, governments, and people in other countries will purchase at each and every price level. It represents all the demand in an economy. So what we're talking about here is aggregate demand's looking at GDP, gross domestic product, all the goods and services produced in the economy. So we're looking at consumption goods that we spend money on, a new couch, an Xbox, food. We're looking at investments from businesses and households. And so when businesses buy new forklifts and things like that, that increases GDP. Government purchases of goods and services. So if the government is spending more money on tanks, if the government is spending more money on office supplies, on computers, on cybersecurity, all those kind of things. And then exports, goods leaving our country. So aggregate demand is going to look at all of these. And some of these, it's not like we've seen in the past. In the past, if anything that has to do with like businesses, we've looked at a supply. Well, here we're making goods for businesses, and therefore it's going to fit with aggregate demand, because instead of looking at the quantity on the bottom line of our graph, we're going to look at real GDP, which we'll see in this slide. The aggregate demand curve looks a lot like a demand curve for a single product. However, there are big differences. The up and down here, your vertical axis is price level. And so overall, what is the price level of goods and services? And this is where we're going to see if it's going up, we might face inflation. Okay. An increase in the price level indicates inflation. A decrease in the price level indicates deflation. And so we're going to have a demand curve that looks like a normal demand curve. As price level decreases, you see that there's more production and real GDP increases. So that's not a shocker right there. So take some notes before we move on to the next slide. You can stop whenever you need to as we go along. Real GDP and the aggregate demand curve. The horizontal axis, as we saw right here, is called real GDP. It represents the value of all final goods and services produced, adjusted for inflation. Think of real GDP as the quantity of the nation's output. So we're looking at the quantity of all the nation's output. We call that real GDP. So the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. As we said, this means consumers, businesses, governments, and people in foreign countries together will buy more goods and services at lower prices than they will at higher prices. I don't think there's anything surprising about this. You and I buy more when prices are lower. Government wants to buy more. Businesses want to buy more when prices are lower. And so as the prices drop, we usually see more real GDP growth. As price level increases, people have less money. There's less money in banks being saved for loans. You can't get as many loans, and it kind of snowballs so that you have less real GDP, domestic products being produced. So we get to the meat of it all, the shifts in aggregate demand. Shifts in aggregate demand show the effects of events and government policies on the price level and real GDP. The coronavirus, when it hit, was a major shift on aggregate demand. We've seen stock market crashes, real shifts in aggregate demand, all these different kinds of things. And so if we're starting at the 1 here, if we're moving out to the right, we've went from this much real GDP to a higher amount of GDP, and therefore a shift to the right increases aggregate demand. Whereas if we shift inward, we were at this GDP, now we're down to this GDP. A shift to the left decreases aggregate demand because it decreases real GDP. Left, decrease in aggregate demand. Right is an increase. So anything that causes an increase in consumer, business, or government spending or net exports will increase AD. For example, higher incomes typically increase consumer spending and therefore will increase aggregate demand. More business investment increases aggregate demand because we're buying more machines for the factories. Higher government spending is going to increase aggregate demand if they're spending it on actual goods. If US made goods and services become more desirable to another country, aggregate demand will increase as well. And so we'll see any of these things can shift aggregate demand out to the right. And at any point along the price level, you'll see that you're going to have higher real GDP occurring. Decreasing aggregate demand. Anything that decreases consumer, business, or government spending or net exports will decrease AD. If there's higher taxes, well, then people have less money. There is a decrease in aggregate demand. If business profits are down, businesses might invest less. They might not build a new factory. They may not add on to their existing factory. They may not buy new forklifts. Decrease in aggregate demand. If the government spends less money because they're struggling, decrease in aggregate demand. If US goods and services are selling less in other countries, decrease in aggregate demand. You also will see this when there's different expectations. If people feel there's going to be a recession, for example, they might save more money, spend less, and because of this, they'll decrease aggregate demand. And so if any of these groups is spending less money, decrease aggregate demand. So to review, number one, what factors can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift rightward and increase? Anything that is going to lead to increased spending by government, business, consumers, or other countries. What factors can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left or decrease? Anything that'll decrease spending by us, by governments, by foreign countries, by businesses. So let's try out a few examples, a little bit of practice here. Situation 1, your government goes to war and has doubled spending on weapons. Is that going to increase or decrease it? Well, this is going to increase aggregate demand. We are now in a situation where the government is spending more, and therefore real GDP will increase because we see more spending occurring. Situation 2, your country faces a depression and citizens are saving up money and anticipating things are going to get worse. You're saving up money, things don't look good. What is that going to mean? That's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. Because people don't want to spend money, we're not going to have an increase in real GDP if everybody's putting their money in the bank and just saving it. Situation 3, I guess I'll sit in the middle here. Businesses see growing demand and begin building larger factories and buying more larger semi-trucks. What does that mean? That's a good thing. We're going to see an increase in aggregate demand because businesses are buying more goods. Real GDP is increasing. Situation 4. Citizens in Japan, a US trade partner, have seen wages increase. As a result, more American products are being sold in Japan. Do we like that? Yes, we do. Net exports, now I'm flowing down here. Net exports have increased. Therefore, our aggregate demand is increasing because we're seeing real GDP is going up as well. And number 5, coronavirus hits and unemployment skyrockets to 13%. True story. Many Americans struggle to pay their bills. While this is clearly going to be a decrease in aggregate demand because we see less money is being spent, real GDP is going to drop because people aren't buying as many goods. So those are examples. That's what we have for aggregate demand. If you have any questions, let me know. You'll do a little worksheet now to look at aggregate demand. After you finish that, you'll see a link on the worksheet to check your answers. I'll have about a 4-minute video to look over how you're doing. So please watch that video after the worksheet and let me know if you have questions along the way. Have a great day, everybody.